Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Dana Whitelaw, the Executive Director of the High Desert Museum, and have the honor of starting our evening and introducing Ellen Waterston. I've had the privilege of working with Ellie for over a decade on various projects, and she continues to inspire me, our work at the museum, and her new book is a wondrous culmination of her commitment and love of our landscape. Ellen hails from the East Coast, and through several interesting routes, including work in Madagascar, another location we both share, she has been living, working, and loving the high desert for decades. Ellie's award-winning writing includes essays, poems, and even a verse novel that has premiered as a full-length opera. Needless to say, her talent abounds. As a literary arts advocate, she's the founder of the Writing Ranch, which offers workshops and retreats for established and emerging writers. She was the founder and for over a decade, the executive director of The Nature of Words, a literary arts nonprofit featuring an annual literary festival in Bend, Oregon. She subsequently founded and is the president of the Waterston Desert Writing Prize, annually recognizing a nonfiction book proposal that examines the role of deserts in the human narrative. Her new book, Walking the High Desert, Encounters with Rural America Along the Oregon Desert Trail, is phenomenal. Uniting stories from across this diverse landscape, the humans and the non-human voices, Ellen weaves an incomparable narrative of wonder, science, history, and prose. This book deeply and cleverly explores the desert landscape and the complexity of the interplay of humans and this amazing piece of the Intermountain West. It is my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Ellen Waterston.
Good evening to virtually everyone. Thank you so much for joining me in celebrating the launch of Walking the High Desert. It was the walk of a lifetime, the walk that is taking a lifetime. I'm indebted to many individuals, trail angels who supported me on this journey, as well as to the University of Washington Press, this High Desert Museum, the Oregon Natural Desert Association, the Oregon Desert Land Trust, and Playa, an artist and scientist residency campus located in the heart of Oregon's outback. As we pause due to COVID-19, it is critically important that our support for cultural and environmental institutions, the places, peoples, and artists they champion, does not pause, does not falter. This book, a blend of travelogue, memoir, meditation, history, current events, philosophy, science, and commonplace book, was completed BC, which takes on a new meaning, doesn't it just, since COVID? But the challenges the book grapples with as the narrative makes its way across the high desert are challenges that are not taking a time out, are issues that, as it turns out, this high desert has in common with many places in the United States, if not the world. It is important that we continue to keep asking these questions and doing our best to answer them. They confront us wherever we are, wherever we live. My hope is that tonight's reading will introduce you or return you to a magnificent part of the world, one that can teach us everything we need to know. Walking the High Desert, Encounters with Rural America Along the Oregon Desert Trail. Chapter 1, High-Centered. First of all, it's Oregon, not Oregon, and it's Malheur out here, not the French pronunciation, malheur, although the French trappers who came through Oregon's high desert in 1819 were plenty unhappy. Once they left the stands of Ponderosa in the mountains and entered the desert, nothing went right. Their cached beaver pelts were snatched by Indians. There was little water, no shelter, no shade. It didn't go much better for the Hawaiian trappers working for the Northwest Company, who came up missing the same year in the farthest southeastern corner of the Oregon Territory, and after whom the stunningly beautiful Owyhee River and canyon lands were named, that being the standard spelling of Hawaii at the time. Speaking of names, the Oregon Outback, the Sage Steppe, the Empty Quarter, the cold desert, the back of beyond, cowboy country, the nothing but nothing, the sagebrush ocean, the great basin, the great sandy desert, the rolling sage plain, the Artemisia desert, all refer to the same thing, the high desert. Since the 19th century, us settlers have tried to name this place, and thereby, as is the fancy of settlers, to lay claim to it. But the enduring fascination of the high desert and the reason its survival as a wild place is within reach may well lie in the fact that this vast open can't quite be named. It stays always one step ahead of the namers, luring us who would try deeper and deeper into its embrace. People start to channel their inner Carlos Castaneda after spending time in this high desert. They also get real. That a rancher hangs a coyote hide on a fence doesn't mean the rancher is angry at the government, as environmental historian Nancy Langston speculated in a January 6, 2016 New York op-ed piece. It means the rancher is angry at the coyote. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. The coyote ate the rancher's newborn livestock. Makes a person mad, states a rancher in typically understated fashion. The only indication of a stronger emotion, the force behind the spit of chewing tobacco he sends to the ground. As far as the rancher is concerned, the dead coyote draped over the barbed wire fence, murdered, robbed, and ate a hole in his wallet. This brief pronunciation and cultural sensitivity guide matters. Simply stated, we must remove our cultural and class filters to have the necessary conversation about this place and about all the people who love it in their unique and seemingly incompatible ways. Those who have never been to Oregon imagine the whole state rainy and green, like Portland or Seattle, and believe that the Portlandia culture, made popular by the sketch comedy television series, characterizes all of the 98,000 square miles of this northwestern wonderland. In fact, 3/4 of the state is dry and separated from the valley, as the western portion is referred to, by the majestic high Cascades, all dormant volcanoes, at least for now. They block the rains from coming east, keep the desert the high desert. Where I live, in Bend, at the foot of the Cascades on the eastern side, the average rainfall is 12 inches a year. As one old-timer said, remember that time it rained 40 days and 40 nights? We got 1.5 inches in eastern Oregon. It's a part of the world where evaporation exceeds precipitation, literally and metaphorically, giving back more than it receives. It's a desert that doesn't get the credit it deserves for its generosity. In April of 2016, I drove the 130 miles east and south from Bend, located roughly in the middle of the state, to Burns to take part in the annual Harney County Migratory Bird Festival, a favorite event of mine. So good to get away from Bend's increasingly California-like culture. A former lumber mill town, Bend is now ultra chic, latte'd, churning with construction and growth, and teeming with self-aware 40-something bio and high-tech CEOs. One of the fastest growing communities in the United States, it boasts a populace remarkably unaware of the desert that surrounds it. Perhaps that's good news for the high desert. Lucky for me, it's only a matter of driving a short distance east until I am reunited with what has become my reassurance that all is right with the world. Vast sagebrush flats, the echo of what used to be ocean bottom, flanked by escarpments and buttes, gnarled juniper forests, basalt canyons carved by ancient rivers. Other than power lines, and perhaps the distant silhouette of a barn or ranch house, nothing interrupts the view. Along Highway 20, between Bend and Burns, if you stop by the side of the road in the spring, the loudest sound is likely the buzzing of a fly. Artist Robert Dahl, who serves on the advisory council of Ben's High Desert Museum, once placed a cheesy aluminum folding chair with nylon webbing in the middle of Highway 20 and sat down for the ultimate selfie and existential Christmas card. Nothingness ahead, nothingness on either side, nothing to recommend going in any direction or not to. Closer to Burns, the palette changes from the muted browns, grays, and ochres of the sage to bright green, evidence of spring melt and a water table that sits just below the surface of the miles and miles of pancake flat fields. Dramatically framing them to the west is the 9,733-foot snow-capped Steens Mountain, its southernmost side a dramatic escarpment that plummets to the Alvord Desert before sliding into Basin, Nevada. Ranch houses in Burns that are built on these seasonally soggy paddy flats don't have basements. Abandoned homesteads and barns shrug their way to the earth as their underpinnings rot. The spring runoff in this landlocked basin creates perfect habitat for birds, and the word has spread. The area is part of the migratory path for a huge variety of large and small winged victories. Birders with binoculars cruise along the dikes that frame fields of hay, alfalfa, and timothy grass, training their eyes on yellow-headed blackbirds, bitterns, meadowlarks, mergansers, egrets, and willets. Visitors learn to return the favor of an index finger lifted off the steering wheel by the rancher as they pass his oncoming pickup, his stock dog leaning into the wind, teetering on bales of hay stacked in the bed of the truck. It feels like acceptance into the fraternity of those who work the land for a living. It used to be most of us could recall a relative who farmed or ranched. Not so much anymore. What started in 1981 in the town's Grange Hall, the Harney County Migratory Bird Festival now locates activities all over Burns and at favorite viewpoints within the 187,000 acres of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, with bird talks and guided tours held within the refuge and on adjacent ranches. You're likely to see flocks of snow geese lifting off the greening meadows like bed sheets flapping in the wind, clusters of avocets and phalaropes probing the marshes and irrigated fields for food, squadrons of haughty white pelicans and sandhill cranes looking as regal and prehistoric as they are, their ungainly squawk matching their ungainly stride. What people come to observe and exalt is beautiful, glorious, fragile. On the Saturday night of the festival, a dinner is held at the Harney County Fairgrounds. In 2016, there looked to be 200 people in attendance, maybe more. In any case, a record-breaking turnout according to organizers. Long banquet tables were decorated with rough-hewn barnwood boxes made by local high school students and filled with wildflowers. Crude paintings of birds, also by students, were on display to be auctioned, as well as raffle items from carved ducks to horsehair bracelets to homemade apple butter crafted by local artists and cooks. The gregarious organizer, president of the Burns Chamber of Commerce, considering all the empty storefronts in town a triumph of hope, orchestrated the evening skillfully as she called out raffle winners and introduced speakers. The dinner was prepared by the members of the Mennonite community. Between the main course and dessert, the Mennonite men and boys in their pressed white shirts, the women and girls in their long skirts and small bonnets, came out of the kitchen and lined up next to the toiling coffee pots to sing in the purest of harmonies. When hay is fresh and new, all my praise to you. When hay is fresh and new, all my praise to you. Presentations featured a talk about sage-grouse habitat, the prospect of the bird being protected, a touchy subject among ranchers who fear the designation of the sage-grouse as an endangered species will reduce their grazing permits and therefore their ability to make a livelihood. For the time being, an uneasy peace had been negotiated between government land use agencies and private landowners who collaborated successfully to protect existing and create new habitat for the bird. The next talk, by the wife of a local rancher, informed the city folk in attendance about what was happening on ranches in the spring of the year, calving, weaning, haying, and then, clearly off message, she kind of reared up and declared that, by golly, she supported her community law enforcement officials and the local government and land management agencies. Harney County had recently and unintentionally made national headlines due to, let's just say, land use conflicts, and, like the sage-grouse issue, was also a sensitive topic among locals. But no matter, no one was inclined to take issue with anything tonight. Nope. If the noisy chatter was any indication, the crowd was clearly eager for a time out from recent controversies, a night out. Strangers introduced themselves to table mates. Ranchers and visitors applauded anything and everything, knocking their water glasses on to the decorative paper doilies, into their whipped cream and fruit salad. A good time. My drive to the Bird Festival that weekend not only took me across an ancient ocean bed framed by exquisite small canyons, but paralleled sections of what was christened in 2012 as the Oregon Desert Trail. The Oregon Natural Desert Association, ONDA, plotted and pieced together this 750-mile trail that starts at the Oregon Badlands Wilderness outside of Bend and continues to the southeastern Oregon Canyonlands that flank the Owyhee River. Other than a few permitted easements across private land, the trail takes pains to stay on public lands the whole way. I moved from New England to the high desert to ranch 4 decades ago. Though I now live in town, my love of this hard-scrabble outback still informs my everyday. So no surprise that this new trail spoke to me, lured me back into the desert. No longer actively ranching, I decided I'd walk sections of the trail and write about it. About what I saw, those I encountered, I would make a point of evenly and fairly presenting the conflicting points of view about repurposing open areas of public land. I prided myself that in so many ways I already knew the players: ranchers, Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, and Fish and Wildlife employees, school teachers in rural schoolhouses, merchants in remote outposts, American Indians on reservations in the high desert, law enforcement officials who some years back were kind enough to wave me on despite my excessive speed as I made my way alongside desolate Highway 20 back to the ranch with a station wagon full of fussy infants and sacks of groceries. I knew and understood desert dwellers. This narrative would be about and with them. At dinner, I asked those at my table their thoughts about ONDA's trail through this wide-open, tumble-dry high desert. As they finished their salad course and passed around the fresh-baked rolls, I posited my idea that the trail is as long and circuitous as it is, not only to lead trekkers through some of the most scenic and heretofore unexplored areas of the high desert, but also because it dares not stray off public lands, lest it create conflicts with private landowners. Did they agree? I wanted to follow, I explained, the course of this high desert Camino that skirts key concerns facing this sagebrush ocean: protection of native ground, protection of habitat for endangered species, elimination of predators, wild horse protection, grazing rights for livestock, hunting rights, water rights, demand for recreational land for motorized vehicles, demand for land for what was touted as low-impact recreational uses. I told them I wanted to show how these issues met head-on at certain points on the trail, how solutions that work for all are elusive, charged, complicated, but do exist. How, to me, the Oregon Desert Trail, as it zigs and zags, assiduously avoiding privately held tracts, is a powerful metaphor for all the land use and other issues facing not just southeastern Oregon, but all of the ranching West. As my mashed potatoes and roast beef got cold, I went on and on. I explained the broader philosophical musings the trail excited in me as suggested by the contradictory rights various groups and users claim. What is wild? Who says grazing's a right? Who says it isn't? What is the highest, best use of public lands? And according to whom? Whose narrative is most compelling and is influencing policy decisions? Their answers and related questions would be an important part of the book I planned. Hiking emblematic sections of the Oregon Desert Trail, I explained I'd also interview other key individuals like them who represent the various perspectives on high desert land use. I'd welcome the questions the process raised and would embrace the conundrum that a passionate love of the same place is not a predictor for common solutions. From these many conversations, I would glean reasonable, collaborative approaches to pending decisions. Everyone really can just get along. What did they think? No surprise, the varied and compelling responses from my table mates at the festival dinner and from those I interviewed subsequently charted the course for this linked narrative and populated the pages to follow. This time, I'd come to the Migratory Bird Festival with not only my bird book, but also walking sticks in hand. My plan was to explore the sections of the Oregon Desert Trail that wind through Harney County before I headed back to Bend. Maybe take the festival-sponsored tour through the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, but this time was different. Most of the birding tours had sold out for the first time in the 34-year history of the festival. The Saturday night banquet was at capacity. Motels were chock-a-block full. Why? Because curiosity killed the cat. Because Burns, Oregon is the county seat of Harney County, where the occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge took place in January and February 2016. It was now April. Eamon Bundy and his band had left the refuge only 2 months earlier. The buildings they occupied on the refuge and portions of the refuge itself were still closed to the public. Damage to refuge structures, to northern Paiute artifacts and burial sites was still being assessed. Burns was now on the map. The occupation had identified a new 1%, those in the nation who had actually heard of Harney County, the refuge, and Burns, Oregon, but United States of America. Ignore what took place there at your peril. The 41-day occupation rendered my original concept for this desert trek narrative a nursery rhyme, la la la, a polite conversation about land use conflicts. The trail was now a mere contrivance to link the perspectives of those who want to harvest natural resources and those who want to protect land for various recreational and environmental reasons. The land use policy options I intended to write about turned into a shouting match during the occupation between, for starters, those who want no government intrusion and those who understand the benefits of government involvement and collaboration. And since the Bundy occupation, militias have gone public. Brother has armed against brother. False information has been embraced as fact. How armed and dangerous we are. How blunt an instrument our thinking has become. How very afraid we are. How misappropriated by the Bundys and their constituents are the United States Constitution, and for that matter, God and his son. How misunderstood the laws affecting land use and, well, everything, if one believes the Bundys, and many do. This unknown region of the United States suddenly became the poster child, not only for land use and conservation issues, but for, yes, the angry, gun-toting disenfranchised and the rural silent minority who in combination helped define the 2016 presidential election, dramatically reframing America's conversation. This demographic like this area of the United States, is no longer unknown or uncharted. The failure of those who see themselves as educated and informed, who are at the helm of this nation, to acknowledge and engage the predominantly white, no longer silent, disenfranchised, as much shapes this book as does the elaborate cursive script the Oregon Desert Trail inscribes across southeastern Oregon. When hay is fresh and new, all my praise to you. When hay is fresh and new, all my praise to you.
Ellen Waterston. Ellen, thank you. Your reading weaves words and high desert imagery so well, and we're so lucky to be spending some time with you this evening to talk about the book. To our audience, if you have questions, please submit them in the chat. How do you find these gems emerging and coming out of your writing process?
Well, hello everybody, and thank you, Dana. Oh, I think that there are all kinds of trail angels. Obviously, the trail angels that helped me along in the process of this book, but also in writing, things just kind of show up magically, and they do feel like a sort of the writing trail angel when they do. When those words occur to you, I do have to acknowledge sort of childhood reading is always a great source of inspiration, given the Ichabod Crane reference. But I think it's one of the sort of the endorphin that's available to writers generally, is when you kind of strike on something like that.
Well, I love that, and it happens so many times during the book, and those are some of my other questions, but I'm going to go to some of our audience questions now. And we have one from Haley, who's curious about your experiences with water, the demand for water, focus on water, and during your walk and those conversations, how did that emerge, and what was that about for you?
Well, in response to Haley's question, there are the water issues for the trekker as they move across the Oregon Desert Trail, and in that case, there's a great deal of advanced planning that's necessary in terms of stashing water and knowing where there are water resources. And obviously, that underscores the bigger conversation about water that is true of the region generally. And the book does address this. The Oregon Desert Trail provides a kind of a linked narrative for a number of issues as I and readers move across this territory. And water is one that is addressed pretty exclusively in one of the chapters. So yes, water resources in a desert are a concern. The demands on the water resources are a conversation, and water issues exist worldwide. So I hope and think that in some of these conversations relative to the high desert, that we'll find that those same conversations apply really, certainly nationally, if not globally.
Right, thank you. There's another question about
being on the trail, and it's from Lindsay. What are ways that hikers can be respectful to the communities they walk to along the Oregon Desert Trail?
Well, there are such a variety of communities. There are small towns, and those small towns really are wondrous things. They are true communities. They offer, each one of them has a particular kind of charm and color, form, shape, resonance with the trekkers. And there are also, the communities of sort of flora and fauna, and then there are the far-flung human communities, such as ranchers, and respecting, if a gate is shut, leave it that way. If a gate is open, leave it that way. Those kinds of things, and not to mention respect for whose property you're on. There are portions of the trail that do access private property with full knowledge of the owner, and so it's that soft footprint that is necessary, really, whatever we do, wherever we are. And also, I think if one is open to it, one will find that these rural communities are really very extraordinary and very diverse. And I hope that comes through in this narrative.
Right. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about writing itself. And do you have any advice for writers, aspiring writers? You spend a lot of time with aspiring writers in writing workshops. And what is your advice for writers who are trying to capture the essence of a place?
It's like anything. If it's a muscle you don't flex, it gets weak. So the thing about writing is to write a lot and read a lot. And if it's specific to place, I think you just have to go and lie down on the ground and put your ear to the ground and hear what it's saying, and literally and metaphorically in that sense. Mm-hmm. I think that one can never fully know a place, even your backyard, even another human. So it's the great exploration and trying to put words to the mystery of that is a lifelong challenge. So my advice would be stop. No, my advice would be to put your shoulder to that wheel and just enjoy it. It really, if you've got the disease, it's just a ton of fun.
Nice. Thank you. One of the things that I wanted to hear from you is what stood out to you and what has stayed with you as you encountered Native America along the desert trail and that landscape.
Well, I think that in the early part of the book, it sort of cries and whispers of the arrival of settlers and the sad history of that encounter, and then the sort of the repercussions of that encounter that have and have not adequately recognized the Native American presence in this region and in lots and lots of places, and that really was further reflected in the Bundy occupation, where some burial sites and artifacts were not respected during their occupation of the Malheur Refuge. But as this book is constructed, there is a kind of a grand finale showing that it has moved from cries and whispers. And yes, there's a lot about the history of the Native American experience that needs to be reckoned with, honestly, but the numbers of tribal members and Native Americans who are rising and answering that call in a whole variety of very compelling ways are profiled, really, mentioned, just a small handful toward the end of the book. And so I think it shows a momentum that's very, very exciting. Certainly has relevance given what we're addressing right now in our history nationally in terms of recognizing people of color and other backgrounds and sort of historic legacies of not good treatment. So I think hopefully that this book in its small way recognizes and honors the Native American presence in this region.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And that's something that I took away from reading it, is your recognition of their presence here since time immemorial, and that's a deep part of the landscape. There's another great question here, and it's a little bit longer. This is from Lindsay. As a rancher and resident of Eastern and Central Oregon, how would you talk to visitors to this landscape when they notice cheatgrass, disturbed riparian areas? And she's asking, as a person who loves ranchers but has deep concerns about the impact of livestock grazing. How would you respond to that, Ellen?
Well, having ranched in the high desert myself, you know, the good stewards of the land, those who make their living off the land, those who are calving in the freezing cold and struggling with first calf heifers and putting up hay in the heat and juggling everything else that they have to juggle, are very, very aware that there is an incursion of all kinds of weeds, not just cheatgrass. That's sort of the headliner, but more and more, there are a lot of weeds that are, yes, their presence is definitely impacted by cattle. That's well documented, but it's also true that many steps have been taken through cooperative efforts with land management organizations and ranchers. And I think that that is something to really applaud on all sides, that is happening. It's also true that how we're able to access land, anything that involves tires or even the soles of our shoes, move invasive seeds and weeds in. So we all have to be sensitive to that and, you know, get to know what those are and pull them up as you go along. But I do feel that ranchers are as concerned, if not more concerned, as many other users of these beautiful spaces.
Thank you. And that reminds me of one of the other quotes that I pulled from the book, and it's from Robert Michael Powell. And you quoted him in the book saying, "People who care conserve. People who don't know don't care. What is the extinction of the condor to the child who has never known the wren?" And I think that there's some interplay there with Lindsay's comment and with what you just said. This seems like a journey that discovered the people who care, and in a variety of ways. Can you talk about that quote and what that meant to you?
Well, I have great respect for Robert Michael Pyle as an author and poet, and somebody who can put words to these kinds of considerations so elegantly and beautifully as he did in this case. The challenge for me here is how you define care. There are many ways to care, and they're not always the same. Brent Fenty, the executive director of the Oregon Desert Land Trust, has pointed out that we love the same thing in many different ways. And that's why the conversation about this desert and other things, I mean, obviously, politically, whatever you want to choose, when we love things in different ways, the conversation gets challenging, but not without resolution, not without the opportunity for resolution. So the main thing is to know. The main thing is to have knowledge about what it is you're choosing to care about or not care about, and have something to say about it, not to just not know. I think that's the greatest danger, is the ignorance of the environment, the land, what we want to conserve, each other. We're talking about the condor here in this quote, but I do spend some time talking about the loss of language as a species, whether it's the language of the northern Paiute, the extraordinarily beautiful language that used to grace all of that territory, whether it's the language of the Buckaroo, which now in its turn is threatened with various land management decisions, and really the ability to make a living. So I think that one needs to be sensitive to all sorts of species, whether it's flora, fauna, humans, whatever, what have you. But this is a bigger conversation, and one that I hope takes place as a result of this book, and anyway, as a result of Robert Michael Pyle putting a, whatever it's called, in the bowl, the small, provoking the conversation.
Indeed, he does that well sometimes. Yeah. And here's another question. This one's from Brent Fenty, speaking of. And he writes, Ellen, you have a long and personal connection with Oregon's high desert. I'm curious if your relationship with Oregon's high desert evolved during the writing of the book, and if so, how?
That's such a great question. And I now realize every time anybody on the news says that's such a great question, it's just to buy time for the answer. So my relationship with the desert certainly expanded and matured through this process, because I felt a real responsibility to be as accurate as possible. This was a lot more journalism, really, and research than is typical of what I write. And I found in the process so many, gems, so many gems of people, so many gems of important dialogue that's taking place. The sort of the cut glass of issues that are really profound and urgent. I don't think, the average bear recognizes that when you're traveling through these vast expanses, it looks as though, if you're a stranger to them, it looks as though they're wide open, everything's fine, nobody lives here. Well, in fact, they're all within a management, the embrace of some sort of management. And I guess I have to say to this question to Brent is that I just realized there's so much more to know. As I say in my introduction, this is a walk that will take a lifetime. I can't know enough about this desert. I can't know enough about places like the Owyhee Canyon lands and Leslie Gulch and all kinds of extraordinary locations in southeastern Oregon that I'm excited the world will know more about, I hope, and will take care of, and then bring that care home to where they live.
I think that touches on, all good research generates wonderful new questions. And I think that that's what your book has definitely done. We've got time for a couple more questions. I'm going to try to get through some of these here. And here's one from Terry. And this is not a softball question, but what are your thoughts on how to bridge the urban-rural divide? How do we educate people on both sides of the mountains to appreciate others' chosen lifestyles?
Well, I quote in the book, it's a little strong, but it is Michelle Obama saying it's harder to hate close up. In her memoir, she uses that phrase, and I think it's very like the Robert Michael Pyle quote, relative to the condor. It's a matter of knowing one another. It's such a difference when we know one another, when we meet one another across a table or across a fence, or walk across the sidewalk and don't retreat behind assumptions or whatever the easy sort of headline might be. And I think that that urban rural, and it's going to be a forced conversation, because more and more people will find areas like this as guests, as visitors, as recreationists, in addition to those who have been in the area for a long time, either in harvesting the resources of the desert versus preserving and conserving them. And so that conversation has been there all along. And now I think with more pressure on these lands by a more urban population, everybody's just going to have to get along. Just snap your fingers and we'll all just get along.
Well, and I think that issue will become more and more prevalent as we emerge from the pandemic, and certainly look for places that are wider with brighter skies. And so I think that conversation will just become more and more prevalent. I wanted to do, let's see, there was another, a question from Sam, and then we'll start wrapping up. But Sam asked, what is that one thing that every time you went to the desert called your attention? And no matter how many times you saw it, it still took your breath away.
One? I only get one? Okay. This time of year, I know I'm in the desert when I hear a meadowlark. That kind of does it. If I can only have one, and I have to answer quickly. But yes. And
Maybe you get like one every season.
Oh, one every season. Well, I mean, seeing a coyote hunting in the snow, that's, and hearing them, it's not such a signature of the desert anymore, given how they seem to have managed the urban-rural divide very well, and they're sort of ubiquitous now. But that call in a great big wide open space in the night, there's just nothing like it. And I think that in watching, and for a sort of autumnal take, the sort of display that willows, these subtle willows do, the sort of the pastel of those willows as they enter into colder weather is breathtaking. It's all just flat breathtaking. That's all I can tell you. And you could see that in the beautiful photographs by Central Oregon photographers that complemented the reading.
Great, thank you. I'm going to sneak in selfishly again one of my questions that I wanted to pull out, and it's another great line of yours, and you talk about it as the pearl and oyster lifestyle that you had experienced in Africa, and it came back to you in the Central and Eastern Oregon counties. Can you talk about that pearl and oyster dichotomy and how that came out in the high desert for you?
Well, what I mean by that is my love of a rough natural environment. I experienced it as mentioned in Africa, and saw people create a pearl an existence. You know, they with that wildness nearby, and in deference to the wildness and honoring the wildness that was all around, but created just a little bubble of I don't know, civilization, whatever you want to call it. That's sort of a big word for it. But it really got my attention. And then when I had been to the Ranching West prior to my time in Africa, both of them just reinforced that for me, that the vastness of landscape was just something I loved immediately, absolutely, and was determined to live in it, and feel lucky that I've managed to do it. So the pearl and the oyster, yes, that is definitely something that has moved me in terms of choosing where I live.
Great, thank you. I want to thank everybody for sharing the evening with us. And you can get Ellen's book at her website, ellenwaterston.com. It's at the Paulina Springs bookstore. The museum bookstore will have it. And the book is, again, Walking the High Desert, Encounters with Rural America Along the Oregon Desert Trail. And it's so much about the deep understanding of place. And it creates a roadmap specific to this region, but at the same time, really deftly applies the same themes for all of us broadly, and especially in the challenging time that we find ourselves. Ellen, your work aligns so much with ours at the museum. Thank you for writing the high desert so well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.